dignity. To defile strangers was tyranny, but to defile one's own sisters in the full gaze of the Senate was something darker still, a spectacle designed not merely to gratify lust, but to announce to the entire empire that nothing was beyond the emperor's reach, not even the inviolable sanctity of Roman family life. This was the stage upon which Caligula chose to unveil the full scope of his madness, transforming incest into a political weapon, desecration into theater, and humiliation into the very liturgy of power. The moment of revelation came not in whispers behind locked doors, but in the blazing light of a public banquet attended by 300 senators, priests, and ambassadors from foreign kingdoms. The dining hall shimmered with golden lamps, musicians plucked strings to drown out the unease of the guests, and senators forced smiles upon their lips as platters of delicacies were carried past them, but the atmosphere collapsed into a suffocating silence when Caligula, reclining at the head of the table, reached for the hand of his sister Drusilla and drew her toward him in a gesture that shattered every law of Rome, every taboo of civilization, every boundary that centuries of custom had carved into stone. The room froze. Men stared into their cups, women gripped their goblets until their knuckles whitened, and the air seemed to vibrate with the knowledge that what was unfolding before them was not merely scandal but sacrilege. Then Caligula's voice rang out across the chamber, calm and deliberate, declaring, "My divine sisters, blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection as Juno shares his." The invocation of Jupiter's incestuous marriage to Juno was no accident, for by invoking the mythology of Rome's king of gods, he transformed his violation into religious precedent, leaving the senators trapped between two impossible choices, to applaud sacrilege or to commit treason. And so they applauded, their hollow clapping echoing through marble halls as their daughters' fates were sealed by their silence. The bond between Caligula and Drusilla had been whispered about even before this night, for during the fever that nearly killed him in 37 CE, she alone had been permitted to remain in his chamber, tending to him while physicians and priests were dismissed. When he recovered, he proclaimed her not merely his sister, but his divine counterpart, elevating her into the quarters reserved for wives, and exiling her husband to a distant governorship that amounted to political exile softened only by distance. Their intimacy was no longer hidden, and as months passed, Drusilla became the center of his rituals, seated beside him during morning audiences when senators presented petitions, presiding with him at religious ceremonies where she was treated not as mortal woman but as priestess and consort, and forced into nightly humiliations that mocked every Roman value. Julia Livilla, fiery in spirit, attempted defiance until punishment silenced her, while Agrippina, cleverer and colder, buried her rage and bided her time, recording every indignity in memory like coins stored for future vengeance. But for the time being, resistance was futile, because Rome itself had become Caligula's stage, and his sisters were trapped as unwilling actresses in his theater of desecration. When Drusilla became pregnant, Caligula's mania reached its apotheosis. Standing in the Senate, clad in purple and gold, he proclaimed that the child in her womb was no ordinary life but the son of a god, his heir destined to rule both heaven and earth. The senators, whose voices had once shaped empires, now bowed their heads in ritual obedience, voting decrees of honor for an unborn child conceived through incest and paraded as miracle. Priests offered sacrifices in the temples, citizens were commanded to pray for the health of the infant, and the city that had once prided itself on law and dignity now celebrated the violation of its own moral foundations as divine spectacle. Yet fate intervened. In June of 38 CE, Drusilla died suddenly, some whispering of complications in childbirth, others of poison delivered by hands too weary of humiliation to endure more. But the truth, like so much of Caligula's Rome, was buried with her. His grief, however, did not soften him. It shattered the last fragile boundary of his humanity. He declared her a goddess, ordering temples to be erected in her honor, commanding oaths to be sworn by her divinity, and demanding that the Roman people worship the woman he had destroyed, enshrining victimhood itself as state religion. For Julia Livilla and Agrippina, Drusilla's death did not end their torment but magnified it, for now they were forced to impersonate her, compelled to wear her garments, to speak her words, to embody her spirit during ceremonies that twisted grief into grotesque parody. To resist meant death, to comply meant surrendering to degradation so profound that it hollowed the soul. Witnesses later testified that ceremonies in the palace required senators to stand in attendance while the emperor demonstrated his ownership of divine bloodlines, proclaiming to them, "If I can do this to my sisters, imagine what awaits your daughters." The message was unmistakable. No law, no tradition, no relationship could shield anyone from his will. The ledgers recorded these ceremonies with the same bureaucratic precision as grain deliveries: dates, times, names of witnesses, outcomes noted in clinical shorthand that stripped sacred bonds of their humanity. In those records, sisters became property, wives became currency, children became entries, and Rome itself became complicit. In the end, what made Caligula's incestuous desecration so devastating was not only the physical violation of his sisters, but the way it poisoned the very idea of family in Rome. The household had always been the cornerstone of Roman society, the bond between paterfamilias and kin, the foundation of law and order. But by transforming his sisters into consorts and his daughter into a goddess, Caligula shattered that cornerstone, proving that in the empire of the insane, even the most sacred ties could be torn apart and remade into instruments of power. Rome watched in silence, applauding when commanded, bowing when ordered, and recording each horror as though it were nothing more than procedure. And in that silence, the empire betrayed itself more deeply than in any battle lost to foreign enemies. For in Caligula's Rome, incest was not merely private depravity, it was public policy, it was ritualized humiliation, it was the declaration that nothing, not even the sacred blood of family, could stand against the hunger of one man who had convinced himself he was a god. The greatest innovation of Caligula's depravity was not that he indulged in lusts forbidden to other men, nor even that he shattered the sanctity of family bonds, but that he cloaked his appetites in the garments of administration and turned personal vice into an institutional machine, transforming Rome's palace into a bureaucracy of evil, where scribes, physicians, priests, and senators alike became functionaries of a system designed not merely to gratify, but to perpetuate degradation. In the east wing of the imperial palace, beneath ceilings painted with scenes of goddesses and nymphs, he established what the inscriptions called the Temple of Divine Service, a name that mocked the very concept of religion. For within its perfumed chambers, the wives and daughters of senators were processed not as worshippers but as offerings, their humiliation disguised as ritual, their exploitation masked by incense and marble statues whose faces had been recarved to resemble the very women enslaved within. To the casual visitor, it appeared a sanctuary of piety, with altars smoking, eunuchs dressed as attendants, and sacred hymns echoing through gilded corridors. Yet behind the curtain of sanctity, the machinery of organized abuse operated with the efficiency of a treasury office. Every act documented, every body accounted for, every indignity preserved in duplicate records stored within the archives. The genius, if such a word can be applied to such monstrosity, of this system lay in its ability to implicate all of Rome's elite, because those who sought imperial favor were given ivory tokens, inscribed with times and chamber numbers, requiring their presence at ceremonies where their wives' dignity was traded for political protection, where their daughters' purity was bartered for contracts and commissions, and where silence became the price of survival. Each appointment was written into ledgers as if it were a Senate roll call, with notes about performance, enthusiasm, and revenue generated. And these documents ensured that no senator could later stand in opposition without fear of exposure, because the archives contained the proof of their complicity, signed in ink and sealed in wax, a permanent record of corruption that served as the emperor's ultimate insurance. It was not merely bodies he consumed, but reputations. For once a man had stood by while his wife or child was processed in the temple, he could never again lift his voice in moral protest, and so the very guardians of Roman law became captives within a web of their own silence, blackmailed into compliance by the evidence of their own shame. Even this institutionalized exploitation did not satisfy Caligula's hunger, for his imagination sought not only to consume the present, but to guarantee the future supply of victims, and thus was born the breeding program, a horror that reduced human reproduction to industrial process. Physicians trained in the schools of Alexandria, men who had once sworn oaths to heal, were now commanded to examine women as if they were livestock, measuring hips, noting fertility histories, calculating productivity potential, and dictating pairings as though they were matching cattle for breeding. Young women of senatorial class were assigned to soldiers, gladiators, or even foreigners, according to what combinations promised strength, beauty, or exotic features. And these unions, forced beneath the gaze of guards and scribes, were recorded with clinical detachment in ledgers that tracked conception probabilities and infant outcomes. Pregnancies were monitored with obsessive precision, diets prescribed, movements restricted, miscarriages punished, births recorded as inventory rather than miracles. And the children born into this nightmare were seized from their mothers to be raised according to imperial classification. Boys of strong frame designated for military training, delicate-featured boys prepared for palace service, attractive girls assigned to future temple work, and less favored children relegated to manual labor. Families were erased, replaced by categories, bloodlines dissected into functions, and the natural act of childbirth transformed into a mechanism of systematic servitude. Yet perhaps the most grotesque of these bureaucratic perversions was the transformation inflicted upon noble boys, the heirs of Rome's proudest families, who were seized not for the battlefield, but for feminization, trained to serve as painted ornaments in Caligula's palace. Within the north wing, chambers lined with mirrors forced these children to witness their own metamorphosis, as attendants bathed them in scented oils, plucked away their boyhood, and dressed them in silks that mocked their lost identities. Hair was braided with flowers, faces powdered into masks of submission, voices trained to rise in higher registers until they cracked with strain, and movements rehearsed until they glided not like soldiers but like courtesans. Their former names, Marcus, Lucius, Gaius, were erased from the rolls and replaced with Flora, Lily, or Rose, floral mockeries meant to sever them from their lineage. In the archives, they were not described as sons of Rome but as male attendants, each with assessments of beauty, grace, and obedience, each reduced to merchandise presented on platforms where senators themselves were forced to select and rank the children of their peers. To resist was to face public punishment, to comply was to endure degradation, and in either case, Rome's future fathers were broken before they reached manhood, their dignity extinguished in the glare of torchlight reflected on mirrored walls. The ledgers of this era, fragments of which have survived, revealed the chilling precision of a society that had surrendered its conscience to procedure. They list not only the names and ages of the enslaved, but their classifications, their assignments, their revenue generated, and even marginal notes suggesting optimization strategies, as though human agony could be improved by administrative efficiency. One annotation recommends increasing inventory before festival season. Another praises the higher revenue of younger categories. A third notes the compliance benefits of narcotics administered to resistant subjects. Such language exposes the true horror of Caligula's system, not simply that evil was committed, but that it was committed with the cold rationality of a bookkeeper, as though suffering itself were an economic resource to be maximized. By the end of 39 CE, the palace no longer resembled the seat of an empire, but a vast factory of exploitation, with departments for procurement, processing, classification, breeding, and training, each operating with the precision of military logistics. The guards ensured acquisition, the physicians ensured functionality, the scribes ensured documentation, and the senators ensured silence. Private depravity had evolved into public institutionalism, and the family, the sacred cornerstone of Roman life, had been dissolved into categories of utility, revenue, and compliance. In Caligula's Rome, nothing was sacred, not birth, not lineage, not childhood, not even the sanctity of gender, for everything could be rewritten, reassigned, and reduced to ink on parchment. And while the people of Rome still dined, traded, and worshipped in temples, the true empire was being recorded in ledgers that transformed flesh into figures and suffering into statistics. A chilling bureaucracy that ensured evil did not merely happen, but endured.